All right, so let's go ahead and finish talking about mollusks. So your four major classes of mollusks are Polyplecphora, which are the chitons, Gastropoda, which are snails and slugs, Bivalva, which are clams, mussels, and oysters, and then Cephalopoda, which are octopi and squid. Okay. The ones that we'll focus most on are gastropods, bivalves, and cephalopods. We'll talk a little bit about Polyplecphora, but you won't be tested on that class. So Polyplecphora are chitons, and what makes them unique is they're kind of like marine roly-polies, as you can kind of see what they look like. So they have 8 overlapping plates, and just like a roly-poly, they can roll up into a ball if they're in danger with those 8 overlapping plates. These live mostly in rocky intertidal zones. That radula, or that scraping tongue-like feature that we talked about that a lot of mollusks have, is used to basically scrape algae off of rocks, and that's what they feed on or eat. As far as breathing goes, they have gills. We see that as an organ in mollusks, and water flows over them, and that's how they are able to take oxygen in, is from the water. Our second class will be gastropoda or gastropods. Gastropods is by far the largest of the mollusk classes. There's 70,000 at least named species of gastropods. Gastropods include snails, slugs, as I mentioned, something called sea hares, which are pretty cool looking if you look them up, sea slugs, and sea butterflies. Gastropods are marine, so they live in the ocean. They're also freshwater, and they also can be terrestrial, which makes them unique. So not only do gastropods live in the ocean, but they live in freshwaters, and they can also live on land. And no other mollusks actually do that. Gastropods are the only ones that can live on land. The difference between a slug as opposed to a snail is a snail has a shell, whereas a slug does not have a shell. So a slug is just a snail without a shell. We talk more about gastropods. Another interesting thing about them is that their shell, when they do have one, is always one piece, or what they call one valve. So gastropods, when they have a shell, are referred to as univalve, or they only have one piece or one shell. This is going to be different when we talk about bivalves, which have two shells. So gastropods, when they do have a shell, only have one. That shell may be coiled or uncoiled. If we're looking at the coiled shell here, the apex of the shell would be the top of it, which we'll talk about similar with the bivalve shells. The apex is the oldest and smallest whorl of the coil, and as the shell develops, it starts to become larger and larger as the gastropod develops, the oldest spot being at the apex or the top here. The shell can either coil to the right or to the left, which is pretty cool, and that's a genetic feature. Some other things about gastropods, when they do have a shell, like we're talking about snails, that's used as protection. So a lot of snails, if they feel like they're in danger, can withdraw into the shell and they can close it off. As far as feeding habits goes, the vast majority of gastropods are herbivores. And just like when we talked about with chitons, how they scrape algae off of rocks, marine gastropods, which are the majority of gastropods, also scrape algae off of rocks using what they call that radula, or that chainsaw tongue I mentioned, that scraping tongue-like feature. Some gastropods are scavengers, though, and they do feed on dead organisms. Others are carnivore, and they actually drill holes into other mollusks and feed on them, which is kind of horrifying. The second class we talk about is bivalves as opposed to univalves we talked about with gastropods. Bivalves get their name because they have two valves or two shells. Bivalves include mussels, clams, oysters, scallops, and those shipworms that we mentioned. The vast majority of bivalves are sessile, so they kind of just sit at one point and don't move. There are some, like scallops, though, which can swim through the water by clapping their shells together. Bivalves are filter feeders, so they don't necessarily have a radula to feed on algae with. Instead, they feed like sponges, where they pull plankton and other small microorganisms from the water in order to feed and filter them out. As I mentioned, they have no radula. They also have no head. All the other mollusks have a head or are cephalized. Bivalves are not. Some other things about bivalves, their two shells are held together by this hinge ligament. So the way they open up, it's kind of like clapping, you would say. So imagine if you have your two wrists together and you open your wrists up and then you clap your hands together. Okay, that's pretty much how bivalves open. The oldest part of the shell, or the apex of the shell on the bivalve, is called the umbo. It starts at the top here, and then the shell grows from that umbo. And just like a tree, the more rings the shell of a bivalve has, the older that bivalve is. Bivalves both have in-current and ex-current siphons. Siphons are these right here. They're used outside of the bivalve so that it could stay shut, but still be able to pump water in and out of the bivalve. And the whole reason it wants to do this is so that one, gas exchange, it can take in oxygen and let out carbon dioxide. So it goes through the in-current siphon and out through the ex-current siphon. It wants to use it for filter feeding as well as jet propulsion. So it will either use this to exchange gases with the environment, take in oxygen, pump out carbon dioxide, filter feed from the water, or to use jet propulsion to get away from predators. As far as locomotion goes, bivalves actually can move. They extend their muscular foot out between their shells in order to move around. And then some bivalves, like I said, scallops actually clap their shells together to create jet propulsion for them to swim. Some other things about bivalves, just like other mollusks, they do have an open circulatory system. The only one that doesn't, as I'll mention, is the cephalopods that we talk about. And just like when we talked about gastropods that live in the water, they do breathe through gills and filter feed. Gastropods that live on land that are terrestrial, though, have lungs, but the vast majority of mollusks have gills. Bivalves in general have gills and they also filter feed. This is kind of what their anatomy looks like. Here's a better picture of their anatomy. So the hinge joint, okay, the mantle, the muscular foot, the gills in the center here. The gills always kind of look feathery. Talking about scallops in particular, scallops are also kind of cool because scallops have a ton of these eyes, as you can see on here. And each of these small blue eyes is actually pretty advanced. They all have a cornea, lens, retina, and a pigmented layer. So scallops are pretty advanced as far as bivalves go. The last class that we'll talk about mollusks is the smartest and most interesting in my opinion. It's the cephalopods. Okay, cephalopods are octopi, squid, nautilus, and cuttlefish. If you ever heard of cuttlefish, all cephalopods are carnivores, so they're all meat eating, unlike a lot of mollusks that we talked about that eat algae or like bivalves that filter feed. They're all marine carnivores, so they all live in the ocean. They all have a beak-like jaw that's between their legs. So what they do is they surround their prey with these tentacles, which the tentacles are actually the foot of the cephalopod. It's a modified version of the foot, and they bring in their prey through the center of those tentacles, where there's a beak-like jaw that almost looks like a parrot beak that they use to tear the flesh of their prey with. If we're talking about chambered nautilus in particular, nautilus are pretty cool because essentially they're a squid with a shell. Okay, so nautilus are they buoyant are able to float by a series of gas chambers that are inside that shell. It's basically a shelled squid. It's kind of cool. If we talk about cuttlefish in particular, cephalopods, these guys are a bit on the smaller side, but these are really cool because they have a curved shell that's completely enclosed by the mantle. And they're also pretty good at changing colors. If we talk about the majority of cephalopods, most cephalopods don't have a shell. So a good way to tell the difference between bivalves, gastropods, and cephalopods is cephalopods particularly have no shell. Gastropods usually have one shell, and bivalves usually have two shells. We're talking about squid in particular, which are a lot of the cephalopods. Their shell's been reduced into this small strip that you see right here, which is referred to as the pen. And this is used for like equilibrium when they swim. You could actually dip it in the squid's ink and write with it even. which maybe that's why it's called a pen. One of the ways that cephalopods swim is they expel water from their mantle cavity through a ventral funnel, and they use that for jet propulsion. Another cool thing about cephalopods is they have a really, really complex eye. Their eye, they say, is better than humans even. So they have a cornea, a lens, chambers, and retina inside their eye. They also have the largest brain of any invertebrate. So nothing that doesn't have a backbone is smarter than a cephalopod. Okay. So you might have heard before that octopus are really, really smart creatures, and sometimes certain groups advocate not to eat them for those reasons. Cephalopods also have closed circulation instead of open circulation. I mentioned this before in the last lecture. This means that instead of having their blood just kind of all over the place in their body, their blood is closed off in blood vessels like veins and arteries, just like we have. As far as protection goes, some defense mechanisms that cephalopods have, they have these cells called chromatophores, which are pigment cells that they use to change color. So this is what allows squid and cuttlefish and octopus to camouflage or blend into their backgrounds, which is really cool looking if you've ever seen videos of that. They're able to squirt water to move away via jet propulsion to escape predators is another way they protect themselves. And then also, as you guys might know, squids in particular release an inky substance into the water in order to act as a smoke screen to get away or to blind their predators. Last but not least, cephalopod reproduction. Cephalopods are kind of cool because they actually have separate sexes. They're not hermaphrodites like a lot of organisms that we've talked about in Nigeria, for instance. They have separate sexes, so there are male and female cephalopods. This is kind of the way that they mate. Okay. When they do mate, the juveniles hatch directly from eggs. There are no larvae, like in some of the other mollusks that we talked about. And what they could also do is, for some cephalopods, they could put their sperm cells or spermatophores inside of one of their arms, and they can remove it and throw it at other cephalopods, and those cephalopods can impregnate themselves with it. But you see here, this cephalopod's impregnating this one. He has sperm on the arm, and he's just impregnating her with it. And these are um, producing offspring here as well, or mating, I should say. Okay, and that's it for mollusks. So you guys have access to these notes, so feel free to read up and read through these different classes as well as general characteristics of mollusks from the two lectures.